Dr. Puneet, you can start your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you're audible.
First of all, I would like to thank NB and Mayur Priyanka sir for allowing us to present the cases in the national platform. So I'll be presenting the case. So here is a case of Mr. A, 49-year-old male patient. He was residing in R.R. Nagar, Bangalore, and he has done degree. I'm businessman by occupation. He belongs to upper middle class. He came with chief complaints of abdomen distension since 3 years, which increased since 1 week, and pain abdomen since 3 days. History of presenting illness. Patient was known case of chronic liver disease since 3 years. Index presentation was ascites. He had history of abdomen distension since 3 years, which was gradually in onset and progressive, which was generalized and initially reduced on medications, maybe diuretics, and later since 1 year, it was unresponsive to medications, and he had undergone large volume paracentesis 2 times since 1 year. Last LVP was done at 2 months back, and fluid was straw yellow in color. He now came with complaints of increased abdomen distension since 1 week. He also came with complaints of pain abdomen since 3 days in lower abdomen, which was continuous dull leaking type, which was non-radiating, non-aggravating, or relieving factors. And history of giddiness since 1 day, which was mainly postural from supine to standing position. There was no history of fever, no history of jaundice, GI bleed, or no history of altered sensorium, no history of reduced urine output, no history of loss of appetite or weight loss. Treatment history. Patient had history of melena 4 months back. Upper GI endoscopy was done, and which showed a large esophageal varices with mild portal hypertensive gastropathy. Endoscopic variceal ligation was done at that time. So in past history, a patient is known case of hypertension since 7 years. He is on amlodipine 5 mg OD and no other comorbidities. So coming to personal history, so diet is mixed. He consumes 1,800 to 1,900 kilocalories per day and 70 to 80 grams of protein per day, which is slightly less than the recommended calorie intake. And appetite is normal. Bowel and bladder is regular. His sleep is disturbed since 3 days due to pain abdomen. And he was alcoholic, used to consume whiskey since 10 years. 21 units per week, and he has stopped consuming alcohol since 3 years. He is a non-smoker. So family history, there is no history of chronic liver disease in family. To summarize the case history, so a 49-year-old male who is a known case of chronic liver disease with portal hypertension with history of large volume paracentesis and endoscopic variceal ligation in past, presented with increased abdomen distension with pain abdomen with postural hypotension.
So,
yes, sir.
Sir, you are not audible, Mahesh, sir.
Dr. Goenka, please unmute.
So my question to you is that can you give us a little more details about the character of the pain? And you did mention about the location, but can you do a little bit of more details of pain abdomen? One. And number two, without going further, when a patient with chronic liver disease comes to you with pain abdomen, what are the various things which start striking your mind?
Yes, the pain, first of all, the pain was in lower abdomen, sir. Location was lower abdomen, which was dull aching, continuous type of pain.
It means in the midline or on the sides?
In the midline and both the sides, sir. So midline and both the sides.
Was there any change with position? I mean, in any different position, was the pain increasing?
No, sir. There was no postural variation, and there was no aggravating or relieving factors, sir. And with this history of previous history of ascites and presently also increasing abdomen distension, I would like to consider spontaneous bacterial peritonitis as my first differential diagnosis, sir.
So if it is SBP, how would you explain postural hypertension?
Yes, sir. So for postural hypotension, so the next differential diagnosis I would like to consider is any intra-abdominal bleed, sir.
No, even in SBP, can you get postural hypertension if there is sepsis, if there is hypotension?
Yes, sir. If there is sepsis, there may be postural hypotension, sir.
So you think it's a parietal type of pain or a visceral type of pain?
So it was more of a visceral type of pain, sir.
Mhm.
Oh.
So what will happen in spontaneous bacterial peritonitis? What will be the type of pain? Will it be visceral pain or will it be parietal pain?
Sorry, sir. It was a parietal type of pain. So in SBP, it will be parietal type of pain, sir.
How do you differentiate visceral pain from parietal pain?
So if it is visceral type of pain, usually it will be if it originates from the organ like intestine, there will be colicky type of pain, sir.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
What
and
is the
it-
nature of pain? Then
so and then mm,
what is your
So-
usual location of a visceral pain?
so usually in central
All right.
location.
And what happens with the posture and so parietal pain? Usually, what will happen? The patient's
Yes, sir.
change of posture will increase, or
It will reduce the pain, sir, with parietal type of pain.
why it should reduce the pain. Did you say that? Say what happens in peritonitis?
So the patient will be still, sir. So if there is a change in posture, there will be increase in pain, sir.
You're contradicting yourself, huh?
Sorry, sir. Like parietal pain, there will be increase in pain in change in posture, sir.
Okay, let's move on. So you'll think of spontaneous bacterial peritonitis. You also
Yes,
talked about intra-abdominal bleed.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
If
So-
the pain location was on the upper abdomen, what would you think? I mean, yes, this patient has lower abdominal pain. You think of this. If the similar pain was in the upper abdomen,
Yes,
are there
sir.
any different diagnosis?
Yes, sir. I would like to keep acute pancreatitis as my differential, sir. And
Patient CLD,
in
anything
the setting of
specific?
CLD,
alcohol with alcohol history, that might be one possibility. And second possibility would be portal vein thrombosis, sir. Portal vein thrombosis. And the third possibility would be hepatocellular carcinoma, sir.
complicated, uncomplicated.
A complicated hepatocellular carcinoma.
What complication?
A rupture of HCC, sir.
Okay, we have about 144 attendees at this moment. So I would welcome if they mention their own possibilities on the chat box. So let's see what all are thinking about in this situation. This patient has a known CLD, had paracentesis several times. Now it's more or less a refractory ascites and is presenting with significant abdominal pain in the lower abdomen. All right, while we wait for some of the more comments from the DNB students, let's move forward.
Yes, sir. So my provisional diagnosis after history was decompensated chronic liver disease, ethanol as the etiology, with features of portal hypertension in the form of ascites and esophageal varices, and complication of probable spontaneous bacterial peritonitis with sepsis, with systemic hypertension. So, and I would like to consider other differentials like hepatocellular carcinoma and portal vein thrombosis. So moving on to examination. So general examination.
There are a lot of comments in the chat box and a lot of comments about possibility of portal vein thrombosis. And of course, SBP, some people have talked about SCC. Some people have also talked about acute hepatic vein thrombosis. Where do you put acute hepatic vein thrombosis as a differential? We didn't discuss that. Where will be pain of acute?
What would be the presentation of hepatic vein thrombosis?
Sir, it would be. Hello. Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, it would be upper abdomen only, sir.
So hepatic vein thrombosis can happen in the setting of CLD, but the usual presentation will not be the lower abdominal pain.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So the patient was moderately built and nourished, conscious, well-oriented to time, place, and person. His height was 175 centimeters, weight was 70 kgs, and corrected BMI was 18.3. and his blood pressure on supine position was 100/70, and on standing position, it was 80/50 millimeters of mercury. His pulse,
Can you explain to the attendees how did you correct the BMI?
yes, sir. So for every 5% increase in, so if it is mild ascites, sir, so we need to add 5% of the additional. So we need to subtract the 5% of the weight, sir. For moderate ascites, we need to subtract 10%, and for large ascites, we need to subtract 15% of the weight. And for if there is bilateral pilled edema, we need to subtract another 5% of the weight, sir.
Mhm. All right, carry on.
So his pulse rate was 112 beats per minute, and respiratory rate was 20 cycles per minute, and his temperature was 98 Fahrenheit. Pallor was present, bilateral pitting pilled edema was present. There was no icterus or clubbing. Coming to systemic examination, per abdominal examination, on inspection, abdomen was uniformly distended, umbilicus was pushed downwards and everted, and there was no umbilical hernia. Flanks were full, all quadrants moved equally with respiration. There were no visible veins over abdomen and back veins. There were no scars or sinuses, and no visible pulsations. Hernial orifices were intact. On palpation, there was no local rise of temperature, and mild tenderness present in the hypogastric region, right and left iliac fossa. So there was no guarding or rigidity, and liver was not palpable, and splenomegaly was present. External genitalia was normal. So on percussion, shifting dullness was noted, and on auscultation, bowel sounds were normal, and no arterial bruit or venous hum. Perrectal examination was normal. So other systemic examinations were essentially normal, and there were no flaps.
So what are the additional findings which you have got after examination when compared to the after history?
Yes, sir. So one is postural hypotension, sir. So from standing to supine to standing, so there is 20 mmHg of fall in systolic blood pressure and 20 mmHg of fall in diastolic blood pressure. There is tachycardia of 112 beats per minute, and pallor was present, sir. So which suggests there is there may be underlying bleeding.
But there is no history of melena.
Yes, sir. There is no history of any GI bleed, sir. There is no history of any hematemesis or melena.
So where is the bleed now?
So I would like to consider any intra-abdominal bleed, sir. It may be bleed from any ectopic varices.
Was there any history of LVP in the recent past before pain?
Yes, sir. LVP was done 2 months prior, sir, and fluid was straw yellow in color. So there was no injury to any vessels there, sir.
So if you talk of intra-abdominal bleed, you mentioned about collaterals bleeding in the abdominal cavity. Did I
Yes,
hear you
sir.
right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. And what are the other mechanisms of intra-abdominal bleed in a setting of CLD?
Sir, one is rupture of HCC, sir.
Mhm.
And the second one is ectopic variceal bleeds.
When you say ectopic variceal bleed, what varices are you talking about?
Sir, basically, if it is intra-abdominal, it may be a peritoneal or retroperitoneal bleed, sir.
Mhm.
This is.
How common is that?
So it is a very rare diagnosis, sir. So basically, it is less than around 2% of the ectopic varices.
Oh. And what's the usual setting for these varices to bleed? Before you proceed, can you tell me where there is more likelihood of bleeding from these varices or existence of these varices?
Yes, sir. So when the portal venous pressure is very high, sir. So that is one of the cause for spontaneous rupture, spontaneous bleed of these ectopic varices. And
Again, more frequently seen when there is a surgery done in the intra-abdominal surgeries which are done, so that from the site of the scar or site of anastomosis, there may be collaterals which may bleed intra-abdominally. All right, we will. I'm sure you will review the subject a little more details later on. Carry on.
yes, sir. So So the other possibilities, still I would consider spontaneous bacterial peritonitis and portal vein thrombosis or HCC. So on investigating,
Also remember that not necessarily the pain and the findings have to be related to CLD. So you should always keep the common possibilities which can be there in absence of CLD also. And you should keep your horizon wider. If you're given a case, it is not necessary that you have to knit together and everything has to fit into CLD.
okay, sir. Okay. Yes.
All right.
So on investigating, his hemoglobin was 6 gram per deciliter. Platelets were 90,000. Total counts were 5,600. His INR was 1.6. And LFT, there was mild derangement with total bilirubin of 1.2, albumin of 2.7, AST of 56, ALT of 23, alkaline phosphatase 71, and GGT of 20. His urea was 20, creatinine 0.8, sodium was 132, and potassium was 4.3.
So again, it indicates that he has bled.
Yes, sir. There is obvious bleeding is present, sir.
Okay.
So,
You come again. Why did you say that obvious bleeding has taken
so
place?
because his hemoglobin is 6, sir, with hemoglobin 6 and with the tachycardia, with the postural hypotension, and so with this, combining all these features, so
Agreed. But then hemoglobin of 6 and a platelet count of 90,000 in the setting of CLD
yes, sir.
can be because other mechanisms also. You have to think of a possibility of hypersplenism,
Yes, sir.
which can cause at least a bicytopenia in this situation.
Yes, sir. That may be possible, sir. But usually in chronic anemia, there won't be tachycardia and postural hypotension.
Okay.
So with this background, I would like to consider bleed as first possibility, sir. So we went ahead with upper GI endoscopy. So there were 2-column grade 1 esophageal varices. There were no RCS, and mild portal hypertensive gastropathy was present. So which was not the source of bleed. And on sigmoidoscopy, there were no rectal varices, and normal colored stools were noted. So ultrasound abdomen was done in casualty itself. So we thought of getting the ascitic fluid analysis done. So we just went ahead with ultrasound guided tapping, and ultrasound was done. So during ultrasound, chronic liver parenchymal disease was noted with hyperechoic collection noted in the pelvis.
So what do you think? I mean, how is the collection usually, and what is the significance of hyperechoic collection?
Sir, hyperechoic collection, it may be because of any collection of blood, sir. Like any hematoma or hemoperitoneum. So it needs a further evaluation for the source of bleeding, sir.
Okay, agreed totally that hyperechoic would point towards this could be blood, but can there be a differential diagnosis for hyperechoic collection? Can necrotic material sepsis can cause hyperechoic collections?
Yes, sir. Possible, sir.
All right, carry on.
So we went ahead with CECT abdomen. So it showed features of chronic liver disease, and multiple collaterals were present, portosystemic collaterals in esophageal, perigastric, peripancreatic, perisplenic, umbilical, and anterior abdominal wall, and in mesentery, along with splenorenal shunt. So this is one of the collaterals, so which is basically the vein of Ritzius. So it drains the SMV and inferior mesenteric vein to the lumbar and intercostal veins. So here there was ooze from this collaterals. So this was the source of bleed in this case. So this was the hematoma collection which was present in the pelvis. So measured around 12 into 7 centimeters. It was extending up to umbilical region, which was suggestive of hematoma.
So how would you manage this? I mean, what would be your first thing? And then now that CT has showed, yes, it's an intra-abdominal, spontaneous intra-abdominal bleed.
Yes, sir.
How would you manage this?
Yes. First, I would like to stabilize the patient, sir. First, blood transfusion needs to be given.
What should be your target hemoglobin or PCV?
Target hemoglobin of 7 to 8, sir.
So what if my target hemoglobin is around 8 to 10? What are the, I mean, how does it alter the management? Why not 8?
Yes. So if there is like we need to, if we try to correct more than 8, the viscosity of the blood will increase and chances of bleeding will be more, sir.
So are there any situation where you have your target you will keep higher than normal? Normally you will keep 7.5, I agree. But
Yes,
are there a subset of people where the target will be higher?
Any specific comorbidities or anything which you think?
in the underlying cardiac disease, we need to.
So if there is ischemic heart disease, then or coronary arterial disease as we usually call it, then you should keep the target higher because low hemoglobin can precipitate a myocardial event.
Myocardial infarction. Yes, sir.
So there is another question from the audience. Was there any swelling palpable since there was a collection of 12 into 7 centimeters?
So the ascites was diffuse, sir. So there was no like
It was not well formed.
demarcated. It was, yes, sir. It was not demarcated from the ascites. The swelling was not demarcated from ascites.
Okay. So how do you manage this? I mean, what are the options here now?
Yes, sir. One option would be angioembolization, sir.
And before that, any role of vasopressors, vasoactive agents?
Yes, sir. But in ectopic viruses, so the chances of rebleeding will be more with a medical line of management, sir.
No, but you will not wait. You will not. There will be a window period where you will want the portal pressure to come down, and
Yes, sir.
you will not just go for embolization or a vascular intervention immediately. I mean, you need to possibly reduce the portal pressure because ultimately it's the portal pressure which is causing the.
Yes, sir. Sure, sir. So first, we can consider vasopressors, sir.
Mm.
So after that, so is angioembolization. So if it fails, then we need to consider TIPS. So if it's still further bleeding with TIPS, then surgery would be the last option.
So you showed us some of the pictures of CT scan, but how was the splenoportal axis looking like? Was there any other natural shunts which were there? Were there any collaterals in other areas? Can you give us some more details about CT pictures?
Yes, sir. So actually, I don't have the pictures of other collaterals, sir. So there were collaterals in the esophageal, perigastric, peripancreatic, and perisplenic area, and in umbilical region, and also there was splenorenal shunt, sir.
But the shunt was small. I mean, that is what you need to highlight. I mean, if the shunt was large, it's like a spontaneous tips.
Yes, sir.
And the splenoportal axis was not thrombosed.
There was no thrombosis.
No, sir. There was no thrombosis.
So what are the, I mean, what are the contraindications for tips? You're telling about tips. What are the indications and what are the contraindications?
Yes, sir. So there are absolute indications for TIPS, sir. So it is like congestive cardiac failure or severe. Yes, sir. Contraindications for TIPS. Sir. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So the absolute contraindications for TIPS are like congestive cardiac failure, sir, and severe pulmonary hypertension, and any bacteremia, or if there is any infection, and any if there is any large liver cysts or any biliary obstructions, and so other relative contraindications are hepatic encephalopathy and like tumors like HCC or metastasis of in the liver.
Any mild criteria?
So mild more than 18 is also contraindication, sir. A relative contraindication. So usually MELD less than 15, there will be good chances of recovery from tips, less chances of rebleeding from after tips, and 15 to 24, and so the is like a moderate chances of rebleeding, and more than 24, if the MELD is more than 24, so there are high chance of rebleeding after tips.
No, it's not a question of rebleeding. I mean, when we are talking about MELD and TIPS, we are talking basically about encephalopathy, the deteriorating liver function. So it's not the chance of rebleed which is the only important thing. It's mostly that you are compromising with the kidney liver functions further, and there may be encephalopathy. In fact, I would be very, very reluctant to do a TIPS in a patient who has encephalopathy. You mentioned this is a relative contraindication, but then in a patient who is an encephalopathy, I think I'll be very, very reluctant to do a TIPS in that situation. Dr.
Yes.
Akash, Dr. Yeah, any other comments? Dr. Adarsh?
Yes, sir. I mean, yeah, this, if you can just show what was done to this patient, and that would be better.
Yes, sir. So the final diagnosis was a chronic liver disease with hemoperitoneum, which was secondary to rupture of intra-abdominal varix. So patient underwent TIPS. So his pre-procedure portal venous pressure was 37 millimeters of mercury, and post-procedure it was 26 millimeters of mercury. So, and also on angiogram was done. So it showed oozing in the superior mesenteric vein ectopic varix in the umbilical region. So we can see here. And so embolization of oozing SMV ectopic varix was done using the coil. So post-coiling venogram showed no obvious contrast leak.
So here we combine the therapy of both TIPS plus angioembolization, so that the rebleed chances would be less.
So how was the supramesenteric vein approached through the portal vein only? No?
Yes, yes. So
Yes, sir.
once the TIPS was done through the TIPS, they went through the portal vein into this SMV.
All right. And so the on the table you could see that the collaterals stopped filling up.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Immediately after coiling, so it was the leak was stopped, sir.
All right. So what are the chances of recurrence in this patient?
Combined with TIPS and angioembolization using coils, sir. So the chances of rebleeding would be like less than 20%, sir.
Okay. Have you reviewed the subject? You have?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I have little review of literature, sir.
You can just go to the table and.
Yes, sir. So this is the summary of 35 cases, sir. Hardly 35 cases have been mentioned in the literature. So the most common presentation was hypotension or shock, which was present in 68% of the cases, and pain abdomen in 65% of cases, and abdomen distension 42%. So it was diagnosed by paracentesis, where bloody tap was present in 62%, and through arteriography in 17% of cases. So the source of bleeding, it was 54% in unknown intraperitoneal source, and it was 20% in umbilical veins, Ritzius vein in 17%, and 14% in retroperitoneal varices. So here they were treated with 77% of them underwent surgery. So here surgical variceal or vein ligation was done, and clinically managed, medically managed with 17% of the cases, and portocaval shunt, which was surgically done in 8.6%, and angioembolization was done in only one patient. And a higher rate of mortality with 65% of mortality was seen with this meta-analysis. So this is the study where the efficacy of TIPS in ectopic varices. So in peritoneal varice of 6% was present in this study, where one of the three patient rebled after TIPS. So after angioembolization, the rebleeding rate is up to 65%. So after TIPS, it is 21 to 37%. And so in one of the study published in Journal of Hepatology, So TIPS alone, there is rebleed of 42%, and with TIPS and angioembolization, there is rebleed of 28%. So with BRTO, 17 to 30% of rebleeding. So yes, sir. So high index of suspicion to make the diagnosis of ectopic varices, and given varied location and complex manifestations, a multimodality approach is required. So early diagnosis is crucial, and if endoscopy fails to reveal a source, contrast enhanced CT is strongly recommended. And interventional radiological procedures using angioembolization, TIPS and BRTO approaches may offer definitive therapies. Thank you, sir.
I think interesting case. We rarely see such a setting, well managed and good review. So any comments? Otherwise, we'll move on to the second presentation. Dr. Adarsh, comment to me?
No, sir. I think we'll move on to the next case, sir.
One question which has been asked, and I don't know whether we have answer to this, is that why in some cases the esophageal varices are small and there are ectopic varices which are large?
And one, actually, in this patient, banding was done 3 months ago. So that is one thing. And two, I mean, it's just the collaterals which are there, and I mean, the wall of the intra-abdominal varices are much thinner, and these things are more prone to bleed. Probably some cough or some intra-abdominal pressure which has bled may not be related to LVP.
Yeah. Overall, ectopic varices are more common in extrahepatic portal venous obstruction than in intrahepatic diseases. We see much more in extra EHPVO than in cirrhosis. Right? Carry on.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Jairaj Bomman. I'm the third year DNB resident at BJS Global Hospital. Before I start, I would like to thank Dr. Mahesh Goenka sir and Dr. Adarsh Sikhe sir and NB board for giving me opportunity to present the case at this platform. So we have a 74-year-old elderly male patient who presented with difficulty in swallowing since last 2 months and with a history of weight loss over last 2 months. The patient was having difficulty in swallowing since last 2 months, which was insidious in onset, progressive in nature. To start with, it was only for the solid foods, and which later progressed to involve even the semi-solid food. The intensity of difficulty was same throughout the meal, and the patient gives history that the dysphagia started 1 month after the last endoscopy, which was done for his esophageal varicose assessment, and banding was done. And the patient underwent similarly endoscopy 4 times, and the banding was done all the 4 times in the last 1 year of duration. And the last endoscopy was and banding was done 3 months back, before 3 months back. Patient also gives history of weight loss of around 5 kgs over the last 2 months. There's no history of pain during swallowing, nasal regurgitation or hoarseness of voice. There's no history of vomiting, recurrent regurgitation, coughing or wheezing, hematemesis, melena, pain abdomen, jaundice or increase in the intra-abdominal distension, and there is no history of altered sensorium. Coming to past history, he was a known case of diabetes mellitus since last 25 years on medical management with insulin and oral hypoglycemic agents. Myasthenia gravis since last 14 years. He underwent a CABG for 7 years back, and is diagnosed with decompensated chronic liver disease, portal hypertension with ascites and esophageal varices and recurrent esophageal variceal banding for since last 2 years. Family history, rest all other family members are keeping good health. To personal history, he was calorie requirement was 2,200 kilocalories per day, but consumption was 1,400 kilocalories. His appetite was reduced. Sleep was adequate 6 to 8 hours per day. There was no altered sleep pattern or excessive day sleeping. Bowel habits 2 to 3 times per day. There was no melena, and bladder 4 to 5 times per day. There was no history of addictive habits. To summarize, we have a 74-year elderly male. This is a known case of myasthenia gravis, diabetes mellitus, coronary artery disease post CABG, CLD with ascites and esophageal varices, presented now with progressive dysphagia, and which appears to be secondary to esophageal obstruction. It is mechanical cause for this dysphagia.
See, this patient also has myasthenia gravis. So how would you differentiate? Is it neurological dysphagia versus esophageal dysphagia? Why is it
Sir,
due to myasthenia gravis that is dysphagia?
Sir, first point I would like myasthenia gravis, as we know that the intensity of muscle weakness increases with the repeated activity. So for this patient, there was no such history that there was recurrent deglutition or recurrent swallowing caused dysphagia. The dysphagia was of same intensity since from the first swallow itself. Secondly, there was no nasal regurgitation or coughing, cough reflex was intact, sir. So there was no excessive salivation or repeated swallowings were not required for this patient. So the neurological cause is unlikely in this patient. Rather, the seems to be like, and it is more for solids. It's the starch itself, sir, rather than liquids. So it is more.
I mean, how would you differentiate oropharyngeal versus esophageal dysphagia?
So oropharyngeal, usually they'll present with increased swallowing attempts to swallow the food, sir. Excessive salivation will be there, drooling will be there, and nasal regurgitation will be there, sir. And whereas in lower esophagus, if it is of the lower esophagus, then mainly it will be for solids, and there will be vague pain will be there, sir, associated pain.
So, okay, this is esophageal. Why is it not motility? Why is it not achalasia?
Sir, there is no history of recurrent vomiting episodes is not there, sir. Or there is no drooling of saliva is also not
Those
there.
things
Or
will not be there. Those, I mean, how do you differentiate motility versus obstruction?
motility usually like it will start for liquid diets first, sir. Liquids then progress to involve liquids and solids. But here we have a history of more for solids than for the liquids, sir.
I think it is wrong to say that in achalasia cardia it will start with liquids and then go to
No,
the
sir, neurological, sir. If it is motility disorder, specifically like
Achalasia is a motility, isn't
yes,
it?
sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I think what you are trying to say is that when there's an organic disease like a C. esophagus or a peptic
Yes, sir.
stricture, it
Yes, sir.
starts with solid and gradually goes to the liquids, where this progression may not be there in neurological causes, including achalasia cardia.
Yes, sir. Solids, achalasia, like along with motility, there is a lower G junction narrowing will obstruction will also be there. So that's why solids will be more prominent in, though it is motility disorder, achalasia, solids will also be involved. And in achalasia, like vomiting episodes will be there, sir. Like what they have eaten, that one they will usually like what is vomiting will be there, sir.
Usually, you don't call it a vomiting; you call it a regurgitation
Regurgitation, yes.
because it's the esophageal retained food which is
Retained.
coming out.
Yes, sir.
All right, carry on.
So now that you have made esophageal obstruction, what are the causes of esophageal obstruction you are thinking in this patient?
Sir, this patient, mechanical obstruction is the first cause, sir. That could be secondary to, yes, sir. That could be secondary to malignancy, sir. Because there is very short duration of history for his complaints of only around 2 months, with associated weight loss is also there, sir. So malignancy would be the first thing I would keep. Second would be like he had history of these symptoms after 1 month of banding, sir. So even post EVL strictures, I would like to keep that as a consideration. And third, like reflex, secondary to reflex, peptic stricture I have to keep third option, sir.
What about esophageal candidiasis? This patient is
Sir, could be secondary to candidiasis, sir. That could be the possibility, but there is no odino like pain during swallowing. He's not having, sir, per se. Like
usually candida will not have a progressive dysphagia for 2
Yes.
months like this.
yes, sir.
Okay.
So is there any history of sclerotherapy? I mean, which will have more chances of stricture, sclerotherapy or banding?
Sir, sclerotherapy will be having more complications of stricture causing dysphagia and all, sir. EVL is very unlikely to cause the strictures.
Why it is so?
Sir, because in injection sclerotherapy, the mucosa will be fibrosed, sir. So this causes stricturing. Whereas in EVL, yes.
Hmm.
Ulcerations and bleed are more
Yes, sir.
common in sclerotherapy or EBL?
Sir, ulceration is more common with the EVL, sir. But stricturing and all that more common with the sclerotherapy.
So if I have to speak in one line, if you look at the area which is ulcerated,
Yes, sir.
it's possibly more with EVL than with EST. But if you look at the depth of the ulcers,
Yes,
it's
sir.
more with EST or sclerotherapy than with EVL.
Yes, sir.
So though the incidence of ulcer formation may be higher in EVL, but usually they do not manifest either by bleeding or by stricture, which is more common in sclerotherapy. But sclerotherapy we nowadays hardly do.
Yes.
I think we are almost completely turned into EVL as a treatment. Which are the situations where you will still do a sclerotherapy?
Sir, if there is active bleeding is there, then I would think of going ahead with injection sclerotherapy.
Even that is nowadays not agreed
Yes, sir.
upon. Most of the people would be able to do an EVL. When the EVL came into the being at that time, this statement would have been correct.
Yes,
But
sir.
nowadays, most of the time, even in actively used bleeding varix, you would prefer to do an EVL, a targeted EVL rather than EST.
Yes.
But then there are certain situations, rarely, where you are still required to do an EST. One is a small children, very small children. And why is it so?
What is the cut? Usually, what is the weight above which you can do banding?
See what happens when you are doing the banding, you are putting a cylinder around the scope.
Yes,
You are
sir.
further increasing the diameter of the endoscope.
Yes.
So, in a very small child, say 3 months or 4 months or 6 months old child, each millimeter of the diameter of the scope may be important, and you may not be easily able to pass a banded scope with a cylinder on the top of it across the anatomy. So may be the situation where there are large cervical osteophytes. If there are
Yes.
cervical osteophytes, you may not be able to pass a scope with a cylinder attached to it. So these are the rare situations where you may still prefer sclerotherapy, but in general, sclerotherapy has been completely replaced by EVL. Dr. Adarsh, you agree with that?
Yes, sir, absolutely, sir. I think it's the weight cutoff around 8 to 10 kgs. Only if the weight is more than 10 kgs, our band will go across. Otherwise, it may not. So in those individuals, we can do sclerotherapy. Now with pediatric endoscope, again, we use that. But otherwise, this is how the regular indication is.
All right, carry on.
Yes, sir. So with this summary, I would like to keep the provisional diagnosis as dysphagia secondary to esophageal obstruction. Query first would be malignancy, post-EVL structure and peptic structure. Though in view of his background history of myasthenia gravis, I would still like to keep it as a motility disorder as one of the cause. With decompensated chronic liver disease, with portal hypertension, ascites and esophageal varices, likely secondary to cryptogenic or NAFLD, myasthenia gravis, diabetes mellitus and IS with post-CABG. On general physical examination, we have elderly male, conscious and cooperative, well oriented to time, place, and person. His pulse rate was 68 beats per minute and regular. BP was 108 by 64 mmHg in the right arm, supine position. Respiratory was 16 cycles per minute. He was pallor was present. Bilateral pitting edema was present. There was no icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, or lymphadenopathy. On systemic examination, in supine position, the abdomen appears to be distended, umbilical appears to be displayed downwards and stretched transversely. All quadrants of the abdomen moving equally with respiration. There are no dilated or engorged veins, no visible peristalsis. There is no scar marks. Skin over the abdomen appears to be normal with normal hernial orifices. On palpation, the abdomen is soft, non-tender. There is no palpable organ hematogaly. On percussion, shifting dullness was present. Auscultation, bowel sounds were heard. Rectal examination was normal. Rest all other systems were normal. Even there was no neurological, focal neurological deficit, I could appreciate with the neurological examination. Investigations, his hemoglobin. Yes.
Now that you have finished your examination,
Yes, sir.
has it added anything to your preliminary provisional diagnosis?
No, sir. No, sir. In my case, it has not added, sir.
You didn't mention about supraclavicular lymph
Yes,
node.
sir. There were no right supraclavicular lymph nodes I could palpate in this patient, sir.
Did you do rectal examination?
Yes, sir. Per rectal examination was also normal. I could not appreciate any lesions in the posterior wall, sir.
Okay, carry on.
So investigating, hemoglobin was 10.2 with platelet count of 80,400. His PTINR was 1.28. LFT seems to be normal. Renal function test was also within normal limits. And the ultrasound abdomen showed shrunken liver with altered ecostructure, prominent portal vein, splenomegaly, and ascites. Then we went ahead with endoscopy. What we could see is a 1 centimeter linear ulcer in the lower end of the esophagus, 36 centimeters, and from the upper incisors. Could be query secondary to post EVL or mitosis. And there was also, we could negotiate the scope across with very minimal, not even minimal resistance. And we could appreciate mosaic mucosal pattern with the small fundal varix, a mild PHG, and biopsies are obtained from the ulcerated area and the edges. And the histopathological examination was unremarkable. It showed only chronic inflammatory changes with lymphocytic infiltration.
Can this be CMV?
Very unlikely, sir. Very unlikely because the ulcer is linear and very a single ulcer we were able to appreciate, sir.
When was the last EVL done?
Sir, 3 months prior to this presentation, sir.
So how long would post-EVL ulcer take for it to heal?
Sir, usually like 1 to 2 months, it will be heal. It will heal, sir.
So
I agree that for 2 months for an ulcer to remain after EVL is very odd, and this look is also not like that of an EVL ulcer.
Yes.
Usually not so deep. All right, carry on.
are you worried when taking biopsies because it was a case of post-banding esophageal varices? So
Yes, sir. Because already varices were there earlier, and we had done EVL also. So taking deep biopsies was also a concern in this patient because we might have underlying visible varices. If it is there dilated varices, we could puncture them, and we can go into active bleeding secondary to esophageal varices. Sir. We were concerned for taking deep and repeated
What
biopsies.
would you have done if there was, if say suddenly this patient while you're taking biopsies starts bleeding massively? What were the options you would have in that situation?
After taking biopsy, if he is bleeding.
While taking the biopsy, as it was pointed out just now,
Yes, sir.
that because there is underlying collaterals,
Yes,
there's
sir.
a possibility that while you're taking the biopsy, the patient may start bleeding from one of those collaterals.
Yes, sir.
Now, so what are the
Sir,
options you would have at that time?
Esophageal stenting, I would go ahead with, sir, to stop.
Okay, any other?
Tips would be the second option, sir.
Any other? What about injecting glue?
Sir, this is esophageal varix, so glue, I'm not sure. So, like usually like fundal varixes and all glue with coils will be used.
No, but there's while I agree that for gastric varices that's the procedure of choice, for esophageal varices also one can use glue.
Glue can be used.
And glue is one of the known treatment for ulcers which follow the endoscopic therapy, either EVL or EST. So the other two modalities you talked about, tips and stent,
Yes,
are the other two modalities. But you can also possibly do that. There is a suggestion which has come is doing banding in that situation. Will you do banding in that situation?
Actually, the varices are not visible like it is something
We're
like.
talking about a situation where it starts bleeding from the edge where you are taking the biopsy.
So that's what, sir. Like if it is visible, then definitely we can do that, sir. Like
how easy is it to suck the varices in presence of ulcer?
I think I would avoid doing banding when there is a large ulcer like this at the site of the ulcer itself. I think the other modalities which you talked about is more practical approach. Of course, if you do not have any of these available, then you can take a banding as one measure. People have also used hemospray
yes, sir.
in this situation. So that has also been used in ulcer bleeds and bleeding from the varices. In fact, there is an article from Egypt in which they have used this as one of the modalities, even for varicose bleed. All
Yes,
right.
sir. Yes, sir. So we took biopsy.
What is the SCMS you're talking about? What is the SCMS you're talking about? What stent?
So Della's extra stent, sir. That one will be that is used for
Della's Danny, not Della's.
yes, Della's Danny stent.
Dennis Ella stent. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Carry on.
So he again presented after like 1 month with the increase in dysphagia, like it was involving even the semi-solid foods. And we repeated an endoscopy, and what we could see is the lower end of was ulcerated, and there was complete stricture, and we could not negotiate the scope across, or if there even the narrow lumen was also not visible. So we again took biopsies from this, and the repeat biopsies again were unremarkable with chronic inflammation and lymphocytic infiltration.
So what would you do if the two biopsies are negative? I mean, would you do esophageal dilatation, take biopsies? What would be the regular procedure of choice?
So in other cases, yes, definitely like do esophageal dilatation, then take biopsies. Like deeper biopsies would be better, sir. In other cases, like if it is not of CLD and varices were not there.
So what was done? Is
Uh,
doing a stricture dilatation safe in this situation?
No, sir, no, not in this patient, because he will be having varices and all. He can bleed anytime, and that's still the highest risk. So we will not go ahead with the esophageal dilatation in these patients.
But you need to feed the patient. How do you feed the patient?
Sir, now in this patient, like feeding, we can do jejunostomy, sir, because even to put nasogastric tube was also there was there was no we could not space to pass even the guide wire. So feeding jejunostomy would be the second option, or a direct percutaneous endoscopy can also be done. But because of the risk of this CLD and varices and all, the risk will
Why
be
not
very high.
NJ? Why not NJ? Why not endoscopic Riles tube?
Sir, the stricture was very narrow. Even if you are able to pass the guide wire or the SJ guide wire, then definitely first option would be NG, sir. NG.
See, there are reports of dilatation being done in patients with sclerotherapy-induced ulcers and strictures, and it has been generally found to be safe. In fact, I remember that I was one of the authors of an article published about 25 years back, in which we dilated 20 patients with post-sclerotherapy esophageal strictures. This was published in Digestive Disease Sciences, and none of the patient had any problem. So once a fibrosis takes place to that extent, that it is called a stricture, usually bleeding is not a problem.
Okay.
So if the guide wire can be passed, dilatation is still is an option. Of course, you want to be on a lookout that you're not missing a transmural disease other than just inflammatory ulcers and stricture.
Yes.
All right, carry on. So what was done?
Sir, later we went ahead with the CT scan, both plain and contrast, and what we could find is a asymmetrical circumferential wall thickening with luminal narrowing involving the lower 1/3 of the lower esophagus, and which was suggestive of more towards malignancy with enlarged lymph nodes, perigastric and preaortic lymph nodes, with underlying chronic liver disease with the collaterals in the lower esophageal junctions.
And thickening was extending into the stomach.
Yes, sir.
So
Yes.
this indicates this is not just a post-EVL ulcer related stricture. There is something else, probably mitotic.
Yes.
All
So
right, carry on.
yes, sir.
We have only 4 minutes left.
Yes, yes. Then we went ahead. We took a IR opinion for further biopsy, and we did a CT guided para-aortic lymph node biopsy, sir. And this biopsy showed evidence of squamous cell carcinoma in this, with nests of hyperchromatic pleomorphic nucleus and increased mitosis, sir. So a diagnosis of esophageal squamous cell carcinoma was done in this patient, and this patient after the diagnosis, like he again presented after 1 month of last his treatment. We lost contact with this patient, sir. Actually, one of his relative was a doctor, and he went ahead with the radiotherapy and chemotherapy. And then again, after his completion of treatment, he presented with dysphagia. That time we again did an endoscopy, and we could find that there was lower esophageal structures around 34 centimeters from the upper incisor, and beyond which the scope could not be negotiated again. So we gave a treatment option of esophageal stenting in this patient now at this stage, sir. So we went ahead and over the SG guide where the NITS esophageal partially covered stent was placed, measuring 18 into 150 mm under fluoroscopic and endoscopic guidance.
So when do you place fully covered stent? When do you place partially covered stent?
Sir, if it is second for obstructions and the esophageal luminal narrowing, malignant, then partially covered will be used. Sir. If it is any fistula or perforation, then fully covered self-expanded metal stents will be preferred. Sir.
So I think the basic principle is that what is the purpose, and even if you are doing it temporarily for a patient, then you will put a stent which is easily removable. Partially covered stent cannot be removed.
Yes, sir.
So fully covered
Fully
stent
covered.
when you are doing it for either a fistula or when you are doing it for a stricture where you want to keep it only temporarily.
Yes, sir.
All right. So do you have any further follow up on this patient?
Sir, after this, actually, he did not revert, sir. Like he
Yeah,
after
he did well for almost 1 year after that, and then he passed away. So, I mean, actually, he did well for the amount of liver disease and comorbidities and all these things. He did after metallic stenting. He did well for almost 1 year. This was in 2019 end. Last year, 2020, he passed away.
So this case depicts that there is no relationship possibly between the chronic liver disease and his squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus. They are two unrelated diseases which happen together, and we always try to knit the two all the components into one particular disease, which may not always be true. It's good clinical practice to try to put everything into one basket, but sometimes you have to always keep the possibility that the two components may not be related to one another. Now, there's a question on the chat box just for you to answer. Is that Dr. Manmohan has asked that what is this? He has called it Delis elastin. It's not Delis elastin, it's Danish elastin.
stent.
So, what are the features? How is it different from the other stents?
Sir, actually, for that stent, we need to go into the stomach and fully type of lower GE junction, it will occlude, sir. Then the stent will be deployed. So it puts a pressure on the esophageal varices so that the bleeding stops.
So how is the structure different from the other stents?
So it
Do
is
you
full,
know anything about the diameter of that stent? So it's possibly the widest diameter. It's
3
25
centimeter.
millimeter in the shaft and
Yes,
30 millimeter at the end.
Yes,
So
sir.
it is much wider than the normal stents are, and that's why the chances of producing a tamponade effect is much better than any other stents would do. So I think that's a main advantage of Denis Ella stent. And the other is that you can put it without endoscopy guidance. If you may be able to put it, because there is a balloon which inflates while you are in this one of the steps of putting the stent, and then you pull the whole thing up so that the balloon abuts against the G junction, and then you deflate the balloon before you take out the assembly system. So this can be done on the bedside in the ITU room without fluoroscopy, without endoscopy, if you follow the various steps of the placement. That's something which is different from the other stents. But more than this, it's the diameters which are different. It's a much bigger stent than the common variety of esophageal stent, as you have shown in this particular patient. All right, so we have just crossed 7 o'clock. Thank you. I think both were good presentation. In the first case, there was a CLD which was related with an unusual complication, and the second case is a CLD which has an unrelated complication, which also is important to understand. So, any last comment, Dr. Adarsh?
Yeah, I think we need to think out of the box as well sometime, and as you told, we should not try to correlate under one diagnosis. Most of the time, yes, we need to, but sometimes we need to think broader, unrelated to the underlying primary disease as well.
So thank you, Dr. Adarsh and the team for two good presentations. And that's the primary idea of these presentation, DNB presentation, is not to talk hi-fi. We don't talk about too much about ESD and EMR and POEM and fundoplication, but we are trying to be very basics so that it helps you not only in understanding the clinical gastroenterology, but also in your approach to the exam. We would have 2 more classes in the next 2 weeks, and then we would have some winter break, if you can call it,